Somewhere in the world right now, it is very late. Maybe the house has gone quiet, and you're the only one still awake. Maybe you're in bed with the phone close, or maybe you've got headphones in and the day is finally letting go. Wherever you are, whatever time it reads on your clock, I'm glad you're here, because the story we're about to tell is one that has been waiting a very long time to be told again. Before you drift off, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. It genuinely never gets old seeing someone in Tokyo at 6 in the morning right next to someone in Toronto at midnight, all tuned into the same quiet corner of history. That's something the ancient world never could have imagined. And speaking of the ancient world, let's go back, not just centuries. Thousands of years, past Rome, past Greece, past Egypt at its height. Back to a place called Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where some of the oldest writing on earth was pressed into wet clay by human hands. And buried inside that writing, if you read carefully and slowly and without rushing toward conclusions, there is a question so old it almost doesn't have edges anymore. What happened before the flood? Not a flood. The flood. The one that shows up again and again in texts from ancient Sumer. The one that ancient scribes treated as a wall between two completely different eras of human existence. On one side of that wall, a world that the texts describe in ways that seem almost impossible. On the other side, history as we might begin to recognize it. Cities, kings, records, names we can trace. The dividing line is always the same. A great deluge that changed everything. Now, before we go any further, it's worth being honest about what we're working with here, because this kind of history requires a particular kind of patience. The texts we're going to look at are ancient copies of even older traditions. Some of them were written down hundreds of years after the events they claim to describe, or in some cases thousands of years after. The scribes who recorded them weren't always separating legend from history the way a modern historian might. They were doing something else, something older, and in some ways more interesting. They were preserving memory, layering it with meaning, encoding ideas about the cosmos and kingship and divine order into stories that also happened to carry, somewhere inside them, possible echoes of real events. That doesn't mean we can take them literally. It also doesn't mean we should dismiss them entirely. The truth, as it usually is with ancient sources, lives somewhere in between, in the careful space where archaeology meets myth and where honest interpretation replaces both blind faith and reflexive skepticism. So throughout this exploration, we're going to hold these texts the way you'd hold something fragile. Carefully, curiously, without squeezing too hard. The sources themselves are remarkable, and we'll spend time with each of them. There's the Sumerian King List, one of the strangest historical documents ever recovered, which casually lists kings who ruled before the flood and assigns them reigns of tens of thousands of years. Then after the flood, the numbers shrink, almost as if something genuinely changed. There's the city of Eridu, which the Sumerians considered the first city ever built, the place where, according to their tradition, civilization itself descended from heaven. There's the figure of Ziusudra, a Sumerian flood hero so ancient he predates the more famous names, a man who was told a secret and survived what came next. There's the Atrahasis epic, which frames the Great Flood not just as a natural disaster, but as something far more complicated, a decision made in response to a world that had, according to the gods, become too loud, too crowded, too much. And then there's Gilgamesh, the great king who goes searching for the survivor of the flood and finds him still alive somehow at the edge of the known world and sits down to listen. These aren't just myths in the dismissive sense of the word. They are structured, carefully preserved, internally consistent traditions that multiple separate cultures return to again and again. And the strange thing, the thing that keeps researchers coming back to this material, is that they all insist on the same basic architecture of time. There was a before, then there was the flood, then there was an after. And the before is always described as fundamentally different. ruled by different rules, populated by beings who lived differently, on a different scale, under different conditions. Why would that be? Why would multiple independent traditions from the ancient Near East draw the same dividing line in the same place? That's the guiding mystery that moves through everything we're about to explore. Not a mystery that demands a sensational answer, but one that deserves a slow and honest look. Because here's the thing about ancient stories, they don't survive thousands of years by accident. Something keeps them alive. Sometimes it's religious tradition, sometimes political power, sometimes the simple human need to explain why the world is the way it is. But sometimes, layered underneath the symbolism and the divine machinery and the poetry, there is the compressed residue of something that actually happened, something that people experienced and needed to remember and found a way to pass forward through the centuries. The ancient Sumerians were not naive. They built complex cities. They developed one of the earliest writing systems in human history. They tracked astronomical cycles with impressive precision. They maintained legal codes and irrigation systems and trade networks across hundreds of miles. These were not people who simply made things up without reason. When their scribes recorded a catastrophic flood as the central event dividing all of history into two ages, they were doing so deliberately within a literate tradition that valued accuracy alongside meaning. What exactly they were remembering, how literal or symbolic that memory was, and what it might tell us about the deep past of human civilization, that's what we're here to find out. This is a slow kind of history, the kind that suits a late night. There won't be loud revelations or breathless claims. What there will be is something quieter and, I think, more interesting. The careful unfolding of one of humanity's oldest surviving questions, told through clay tablets, ruined cities, careful excavations, and the patient work of scholars who have spent lifetimes learning to read a language that no one had spoken for 2,000 years. So if you're already feeling heavy and the edges of the room are starting to go soft, that's good. Let these words carry you. You don't have to hold on to every detail. Some of this will settle in the way good history always does, slowly in the background, coming back to you days later when something reminds you of it. And before we go any further, one more time, tell me where you are. What city, what country, what time does your clock say? Someone across the world is listening to the exact same words right now in full daylight, having their morning coffee while you're here in the dark. There's something about that which feels right for a story this old. A story that has been crossing distances and surviving the passage of time for longer than most civilizations have existed. A whisper from before the waters. Let's listen to what it says. The first thing you have to understand is what these texts actually are. Not books, not scrolls, not papyrus. Clay, wet, soft river clay, pressed flat and marked with a stylus. A small reed cut at an angle to produce the wedge-shaped impressions we now call cuneiform, from the Latin word for wedge. Each mark was a sound or a concept or a word, pressed in while the clay was still workable, then left to dry. In the ordinary course of things, dried clay tablets are actually quite fragile. Drop one and it shatters. Leave it in damp soil long enough, and it dissolves. But something remarkable happened to a great many of them. Fires that destroyed ancient buildings and libraries and archive rooms, fires that would have consumed papyrus or wood or cloth completely, instead baked the clay tablets as if in a kiln. The harder, the more permanent, the more likely to survive the next 4,000 years. There is a deep irony in this, that the catastrophes which ended ancient cities often became the very mechanism that preserved their records. When archaeologists excavated the ruins of Nineveh in the mid-19th century, they found the remnants of a royal library, thousands of clay tablets that had been fired hard by the destruction of the city, layered in the rubble, waiting. That library belonged to an Assyrian king named Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era. He was, among other things, a devoted collector of texts. He sent scribes across Mesopotamia to copy older tablets, to gather versions of ancient stories from temple libraries and private collections, and bring them back. Much of what we know about Sumerian and Babylonian literature comes to us through his archive, which means we are often reading a copy made in the 7th century of a text that was itself a copy of something much older, sometimes a copy of a copy of a copy. And this brings us to something important about the language problem. Sumerian is one of the oldest written languages we know of. It has no confirmed relatives. It is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it doesn't connect to any other known language family in the way that, say, Greek connects to Latin or Sanskrit. Sumerian was the language of the people who first developed writing in the region we now call southern Iraq, the people who built Eridu and Uruk and Nippur, who developed the first city-states, who first pressed the idea of recorded history into clay. Their language was probably already ancient by the time it was being written down, and by roughly 2000 BCE, Sumerian had ceased to be spoken as an everyday language, replaced in most contexts by Akkadian, a Semitic language more distantly related to Hebrew and Arabic. But Sumerian didn't disappear from the written record. It survived the way Latin survived in medieval Europe, as a learned, sacred literary language used by scribes and priests who studied it specifically because the most important texts, the hymns, the king lists, the mythological narratives, were written in it. Akkadian scribes copied Sumerian texts. They also translated them, adapted them, absorbed them, and wove them into new compositions. And so the flood stories we have, while rooted in Sumerian tradition, have come to us mostly through Akkadian texts, or through bilingual tablets that preserve both versions side by side, a scholarly tool that helped ancient students and helps modern linguists too. This is why when people talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains the most detailed surviving flood narrative from Mesopotamia, they are talking about an Akkadian text. The oldest tablets we have of it are Akkadian, but the story itself draws on material that almost certainly predates Akkadian as a written language, reaching back into a Sumerian tradition that stretches even further. Tracking where one tradition ends and another begins is one of the quieter challenges of this field, and scholars are careful not to confuse the language a text was written in with the age of the ideas it contains. Dating these tablets is its own discipline. Some tablets include what are called colophons, notes added at the end by the scribes who made the copies, recording things like the name of the scribe, the temple the tablet belonged to, or which version of the original was used. These function almost like metadata, and when they survive intact, they can tell researchers a great deal. Paleography, the study of how the shapes of signs change over time, provides another tool. Cuneiform evolved over millennia. An expert can often place a tablet within a rough time range just by examining the style of the script, the way a handwriting analyst might date a document. But many tablets arrive in pieces, fragments, broken corners and crumbled edges with lines simply gone. Here is where parallel texts become crucial. If a passage from one tablet matches a passage on another tablet found in a different city, in a different context, scholars can sometimes reconstruct the missing lines by triangulation, or at least understand the general shape of what is absent. This is painstaking work. There are stories we have partially recovered over more than a century, because each decade brings a new fragment from a new excavation, and someone notices that this edge matches that edge, the way you might slowly assemble a puzzle from boxes found in different rooms of a house. And because so many tablets were discovered not in careful excavations, but through the antiquities market in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There are pieces of the same original documents now held in museums in London, Berlin, Philadelphia, and Istanbul, sometimes without anyone realizing for decades that they belong together. This is the ecosystem in which Mesopotamian flood literature lives, texts circulating across centuries being copied by scribes who sometimes made errors and sometimes made deliberate improvements, absorbed into different languages, preserved in different archives, reunited by scholars piece by piece. Scholars refer to textual families when describing these relationships, groups of tablets that share content closely enough to suggest they derive from a common original, even when no original survives. The oldest flood narrative we have is probably not the first version anyone told. It is simply the oldest version that survived the particular combination of soil conditions, archival fires, and archaeological luck. What this means practically is that we are not reading ancient events. We are reading the ancient tradition of talking about ancient events. A subtle but crucial difference. The earliest known written versions of Sumerian flood texts date to around 1700 BCE, though they reference traditions and possibly written predecessors that are older. The most complete versions of Akkadian flood literature come from even later. The gap between the events these texts claim to describe, which they place in a period before the flood, which is itself imagined as unimaginably remote, and the texts themselves is not hundreds but potentially thousands of years of oral transmission, partial writing, copying, loss, and reconstruction. This doesn't make them worthless. In some ways it makes them more interesting. A story that people kept finding worth preserving across that span of time is doing something powerful in the human imagination. But it does mean that when someone points to a Sumerian text and says this tells us what happened before the flood, they are making a claim that requires several layers of interpretation. What the text says, what the scribes who preserved it believed, what older oral tradition might lie behind it, and what, if anything, corresponds to a physical or historical reality. Each layer is genuinely worth examining. None of them is the same thing as direct testimony. There is something almost meditative about this, if you sit with it long enough. The scholars who work on these texts have devoted entire careers to reading fragments, comparing sign forms, arguing about the meaning of a single Sumerian word that appears in only 3 tablets and seems to mean something slightly different in each context. They have learned a dead language so thoroughly they can sometimes feel a scribe's individual habits in the way certain signs are pressed. They are in conversation with people who have been silent for 4,000 years. And those silent people, those ancient scribes working in temple complexes by lamp or moonlight, pressing stories into clay, believed that what they were recording mattered. That the question of what existed before the great deluge was not idle curiosity but essential knowledge, something worth preserving with care, something that explained the shape of the world they lived in. Why did they believe that? What made the flood, in their view, such an absolute dividing line? And what did they think they knew about the time that came before it? That's what we're building toward, but slowly, carefully. The way these texts themselves ask you to approach them. The clay is old, the writing is patient, and somewhere in the space between what the words say and what they mean, there is a question that has been waiting for a very long time. Let's keep listening when these texts say the flood. They are not talking about a rainy week. They are also not, at least on the surface, talking about the kind of flood you get every few years, when the river runs high, bursts its banks, and then retreats, leaving silt and wreckage and a few unlucky goats missing. To understand what the flood means here, you have to picture the world these stories grew out of. Southern Mesopotamia is essentially a river-made world. 2 great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, come down out of the mountains and spread into a huge alluvial plain. Over thousands of years they have carried soil and sand and clay, dropped it, moved it, braided around it, abandoned old channels and carved new ones. The land is flat, low and restless. A river there is not a single polite blue line on a map. It is a shifting network of channels and marshes and seasonal streams. It builds up its own banks into natural levees, higher than the land around them, then, when enough water piles up, it cuts through and pours down into the lower ground behind, where people have built their fields and houses and temples because that is where the water is. For the people who lived in early cities like Uruk and Lagash and flood was not an abstract concept. It was something you could smell on the air when distant storms had loaded the rivers far upstream. It was the sound of water eating at a levee wall in the middle of the night. It was the knowledge that you could go to sleep in a dry house and wake up to find water at your doorstep, or pouring through your courtyard, or lifting your world and carrying it away. The Tigris, especially, is a fast, violent river. Its floods, as far as we can tell from modern observations and ancient references, can rise quickly and dangerously. The Euphrates is slower but broader, prone to long inundations that can sit on the land for weeks. Add to this the smaller canals and irrigation ditches that crisscross the fields, the embankments and dikes people built to manage the water, and you have a system that is always one failure away from disaster. When we talk about localized river disasters, this is what we mean. A levee breaks near one town. That town and its fields are ruined. Maybe neighbouring settlements help. Maybe refugees flee to a nearby city. The city survives. Life goes on. The gods can be petitioned. The damages can be counted. But this is not what the Sumerian King List means when it says, "Then the flood swept over. The Mesopotamian literary flood is something different." It is not one embankment breaking. It is the world of the text itself losing its footing. The stories imagine a water event big enough and total enough to act as a cosmic reset. Kingship, we are told, descended from heaven to a particular city, ruled there for impossibly long reigns, then passed to another city and another, and then, abruptly, the list says the flood came. After that, kingship descends again to a different place under different conditions. Before the flood, after the flood, like two sides of a line scratched across the clay. This is an important clue. The flood in these texts is not just a weather report. It is a boundary marker. In Sumerian and Akkadian literature, water often carries moral and cosmic weight. The gods control the rivers. They allot water as they allot kingship and justice. Too little rain is a sign of displeasure. Too much is too. When an entire way of life depends on properly timed, properly directed water, it is easy to see the rivers as a kind of divine mood made physical. Cities, especially, made themselves vulnerable. Irrigation, which allowed people to farm in places that would otherwise be dry, required canals and dikes and long-term maintenance. The more complicated the system, the more a single breach could cascade through it. The same devices that made possible wealth and surplus and temple bureaucracy also created new modes of failure. If a flood tore through a canal network, it did not just drown fields. It could undermine the very logic of the city that had counted on controlling it. So when a story says the gods decided to send the flood, it is not just imagining a big storm. It is imagining the collapse of the human project of order. In city-state ideology, the king is the one who upholds that order. He builds and repairs canals. He offers sacrifices to keep the gods favourable. He organises labour to maintain levees and clear silt. He presents himself in inscriptions as the shepherd who guides his flock through the dangers of drought and inundation. His legitimacy is literally tied to water management. In that world, to say there was a flood so great that even kingship itself was interrupted is to say there was a moral and cosmic failure. Something went wrong not only with the weather, but with the structure of the relationship between gods, king, and people. That is why the flood becomes a moral symbol. In different versions, the gods decide to destroy humankind because humans are too noisy, too numerous, too troublesome, because some order has been broken, because divine patience has limits. The exact reasoning shifts from text to text, but the frame is the same. An overfull human world, a divine council irritated or alarmed, a decision to wipe the slate clean. No ordinary spring flood could carry that meaning. People had seen those floods many times and recovered. The flood, with a capital F, is what you invoke when you want to talk about an ending of an era. It is also worth considering that the literary flood may not come from a single historical event at all. River systems like the Tigris and Euphrates produce many disasters over centuries. Some are local, some are regional. Occasionally climate shifts, changes in snowmelt in distant mountains, or storms in the Gulf can conspire to produce unusually severe inundations that affect large stretches of the plain at once. Archaeologists have, at various sites, found layers of river-borne sediment that interrupt otherwise continuous occupation levels, a thick band of silt where you would expect house floors, signs that, at some point, water covered an entire settlement deeply enough to leave its mark. These layers are not all from the same date. They do not line up neatly into one simple event. One way to imagine the origin of the flood tradition is to see it as a braid of memories. A terrible flood that destroyed a village here, another that ruined a capital there, a generation that had to flee downriver, a temple archive that recorded a year when the waters rose and the city fell. Over time, stories about these different disasters could merge, telescoped in memory and retelling into one archetypal deluge. When your grandparents tell you about the war, they may be folding many years and many fronts into a single narrative shape. The Mesopotamian flood may work like that. Not one storm on one date, but the idea of the worst possible high water concentrated into a single mythic event. This folding together of multiple floods into one narrative helps explain why the literary flood feels both specific and timeless. It has details that sound like lived experience, boats, dikes, rain, the noise of waters, but it is placed in a time so remote that no ordinary king or city can claim to remember it directly. It belongs to a before that is already legend, and in a landscape where water is always both gift and threat, it makes sense that people would cling to a story that draws a clear line between before everything was washed away and after we began again. That kind of dividing line narrative does important psychological work. It explains why the world looks the way it does now, why cities are where they are, why kings rule the way they do, why certain rituals must be performed to keep the gods from relapsing into annihilation. It offers a pattern: destruction followed by renewal, judgment followed by grace, extended to a single survivor and his family, or to a remnant of humanity preserved in a boat. It is also a warning: if the flood once came because humans overstepped, it could in principle come again. The continued existence of the city, the rising of the sun over the canals each morning, becomes a daily sign that the fragile agreement between humans and gods is still in place. So when we ask what Sumerian texts can tell us about before the flood, we are not peering back through a clear window into a wet disaster long ago. We are entering a mental landscape in which flood means an end to a world, the interruption of kingship, the reset of cosmic order. Somewhere behind that symbol lies a long history of real floods, shouted alarms in the night, shattered walls of baked brick, water lapping at temple thresholds. Those lived experiences are what made the symbol feel real enough to last. The texts we have are what happens after centuries of that experience are distilled into a single phrase: before the flood, after the flood, and standing on that line, the scribes begin to tell us what kind of world they believed lay on the far side of it. The next step is to look at one of the most important documents that tries to map that world in detail. A simple list of rulers and cities that quietly claims to remember a time when kingship itself belonged to another age. When modern historians talk about the Sumerian King List, it sounds dry, like a spreadsheet baked in clay. It isn't. It is, first of all, a piece of political literature. It was copied, edited, and recopied over centuries in different cities under different dynasties. Each time, scribes could nudge it, adjust it, shape it, so that the line of kings pointed, as if by destiny, toward whoever was ruling when their tablet was made. So when we read it, we're not looking at a neutral record office. We're reading something closer to a manifesto in list form. The opening move is the most famous. The text starts not with a human decision or a tribal council voting someone in, but with a simple claim. After kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. In that one line, the list tells you what it thinks a king is. Kingship is not invented, it is sent. It is a package of authority and order that comes down from the divine realm and lands in a specific city. Humans don't create sovereignty, they receive it, for a Sumerian audience that matters. It means that the question who rules is, at root, a question about where did the gods put the office this time? When kings later claim to have rebuilt temples, restored justice, or defeated enemies by the command of Enlil or with the blessing of Inanna, they are working inside this same assumption. Rule is legitimate when it aligns with the heavenly decision. The list, then, is not just naming rulers, it is tracing the movement of a sacred thing, kingship itself. The next thing you notice are the numbers. Before the flood, the list tells us kings reigned for spans of time that look unreal to modern eyes. One king is said to have ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000. Some reigns are measured in sars and ners units of 60, and multiples of 60 stacked into totals that reach into the hundreds of thousands of years. Taken literally, these ages stretch back into deep geological time. They would place the first Sumerian kings ruling before modern humans existed as a species. That clearly does not fit with anything we know from archaeology, genetics, or even the rest of Mesopotamian history. So what is going on? Most scholars treat these antediluvian reigns as mythic timekeeping rather than literal biography. The enormous numbers do several jobs at once. One possibility is symbolic numerology. Mesopotamian scribes worked in a sexagesimal or base 60 number system. 60 was a sacred and convenient number, divisible by many smaller numbers. Powers and multiples of 60 show up in astronomical texts, in measures of time, and in religious lists. A reign of 10 sars doesn't just mean 600 years, it shows a pattern, a ruler whose time on the throne is built from perfect blocks of sacred arithmetic. Another possibility is that these reigns compress whole eras into a single named figure. Instead of listing dozens of local chieftains and sub-kings for a given city, the list might package an entire long phase of dominance under one legendary name, drawing out his years to match the remembered length of the period. 1,000-year reign could be memory's way of saying for a very long time this place mattered more than any other. There is also the simple literary effect. By making pre-flood kings basically immortal compared to later rulers, the list draws a sharp emotional contrast. That age was different. Those rulers were not like ours. Their time is measured in numbers that feel heavy, ungraspable, distant. Our time after the flood is measured in reigns of 24 years, 36 years, 43 years. Still long, but recognizably human. Structurally, the King List is very tidy about how it handles this divide. First, it gives you a handful of pre-flood cities, each in turn holding the divine kingship. Eridu, then Bad-Tibira, then Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. For each one or more rulers are named, with their impossible reign lengths. At the end of this sequence, the text pauses and says simply, "Then the flood swept over." That line is the hinge of the document. Everything before it belongs to the age when kingship first descended from heaven and remained in a small circuit of primordial cities. Everything after it belongs to the new order, the age in which the cities we know from archaeology and later literature take their turns on the stage. Kish, Uruk, Wan, and many more. It's as if the list is drawn as a kind of ladder. The first huge rung is pre-flood, then a break, then many shorter rungs climbing up through history to the present king of the scribe's own day. Why would someone design history like this? Part of the answer is ideology. In a landscape of rival city-states, Each claiming divine favour, it is useful to have a master timeline that shows kingship moving in an orderly way from city to city. Rather than chaos, coups and overlapping claims, you get a single file line. When kingship was in Kish, it was not in Uruk. When kingship was in Uruk, it had left Kish. The list simplifies messy politics into a story of orderly succession. This simplification also turns regional competition into a kind of cosmic relay race. Every city that has ever mattered gets a place somewhere on the list. Every dynasty that counts can present itself as a link in a chain that stretches back not just a few generations, but all the way to the first kings at the dawn of time. In doing so, the king list may be folding several kinds of memory together. One layer is bare remembrance. Some of the names in the post-flood section match rulers known from independent inscriptions and archaeological contexts. Others probably reflect dim recollections of real local dynasties whose archives were lost but whose fame lingered in oral tradition. A second layer is mythic framing, the decision to start with heavenly kingship, then a small cluster of primordial cities, then the flood is not something memory forces. It is a choice. It embeds political history inside a larger cosmic story, order given, order broken, order restored. A third layer is number play and theology. The pre-flood numbers, stacked and rounded in elegant base 60 combinations, create a kind of sacred scaffolding underneath the whole timeline. Even if no one ever believed that a single human lived for 36,000 years, the presence of such figures tells you that this age belonged to a different scale. It reassures the listener that the world we know rests on foundations laid in a mathematically perfect, divinely measured past. There are more cautious possibilities too. Some researchers have asked whether the pre-flood section might preserve very blurry echoes of earlier social formations, clusters of powerful settlements along older river channels, remembered not as separate cultures, but as the first cities where real rule began. If so, the long reigns could be standing in for long-lasting traditions of leadership, not individuals. The kings of Eridu summed up as one archetypal Eridu king. Others have pointed out that in many cultures, mythic and historical time blend at the edges. Greek genealogies of heroes, Chinese dynastic lists reaching back to semi-legendary sage kings, biblical patriarchs with long lifespans. All of these show a similar pattern. The further back you go, the longer the lives, the more symbolic the numbers, the more compact the generations. The King List fits comfortably into that global human habit of compressing the deep past into a few enormous luminous figures. There is also the possibility that some of the strange features of the list are the result of scribal editing over centuries. Different cities had their own versions, with their own additions and omissions. When these were harmonized, names could be rearranged, numbers adjusted, reigns assigned or taken away to make space for new claims. What looks to us like a single, coherent document is probably the final layer of a long process of negotiation. Yet even if the details are fluid, the structure holds. Kingship descends. It resides in a small circle of pre-flood cities. Their kings rule for spans that belong more to gods than to humans. The flood comes. Kingship descends again. Now the world looks like the one the scribes know. More cities, shorter reigns, more frequent change. When we read the King List with that in mind, it stops being just a curious artifact of exaggerated numbers. It becomes a map of how ancient Mesopotamians thought history itself was shaped. Time is not an endless, undifferentiated flow. It has a crack in it, a before and an after. On one side, a handful of almost mythical rulers hold a heavenly office in a small, concentrated world. On the other, many kings, many cities, a more crowded and fragile order. The age before kingship changed is what those swollen numbers and spare city names are trying to capture. A sense that once, long ago, the office that now sits in your city, under your king, belonged to a different sky, a different earth, a different quality of time. To get any closer to that imagined era, we have to follow the list down into its first named stopping place, the city that it says held kingship at the very beginning. A place called Eridu. Eridu, in Sumerian tradition, is where the relay race begins. After kingship had descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That line in the King List is not just about politics. It tells you something about geography, about theology, and about how people in southern Mesopotamia imagined the world had started. If you stand where Eridu once stood, you're in the far south of ancient Sumer, near the edge of what was then the Persian Gulf. Today it is inland desert, wind-carved mounds of mud brick and broken pottery. In the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, it was a low, marshy landscape where fresh river water mingled with brackish sea, and reeds and channels stitched the horizon into a shimmering, uncertain boundary between land and water. Archaeology has been quietly excavating this place since the mid-20th century. Under the surface of the mound called Tel Abu Sharayin, excavators found not just one temple, but a whole vertical stack of them. One built on top of another, then another, layer after layer, going down more than a dozen phases. At the base of that stack is a very small shrine, from around the 6th millennium BCE, long before cities in the usual sense. No palaces, no written documents, just a cluster of houses, and, at the centre, a little raised platform with a modest building on it. As centuries pass, that platform grows. The shrine is rebuilt larger, more elaborate. The people living around it change their material culture. Pottery styles shift. Tools become more varied. The central temple keeps getting rebuilt in place, as if the exact spot matters. By the time we reach the early 3rd millennium, Eridu has become a proper Sumerian city, dense settlement, city wall, big temple complex. But even in its earliest village-sized phases, one pattern holds. There is always a central sanctuary. The name of the god attached to it is Enki. Enki's other name is Ea. He is the god of fresh water of the underground aquifer called the Abzu or Apsu, the deep sweet water that, in Mesopotamian cosmology, lies beneath the earth like an invisible sea. If you imagine standing in Eridu's temple in the 3rd millennium BCE, the symbolism would be clear to you in a way that takes us little work to reconstruct. Beneath the temple mound, the water table is high. Dig a pit, and water seeps in. Channels bring irrigation water nearby. In some phases, archaeologists have found what look like basins and small pools in or near the temple area. For a people who think in terms of vertical layers, the heavens above, the earth in the middle, the waters of the deep below, this is powerful. The god of the subterranean fresh water is worshipped in a place where, if you go down, water comes up. The temple is like a plug or a wellhead, a fixed point where the deep and the surface world meet. Later myth will picture Eridu almost literally as this junction. In Sumerian hymns, Eridu is described as the place where the holy house of the Abzu stands. Enki's temple is called Abzu, House of the Deep. The city is imagined as sitting on the edge of the primordial waters, the point where order in the form of a built sanctuary is anchored right up against chaos in the form of the undifferentiated abyss. If you zoom out for a moment, you can see why a city like that would make a good candidate for first city. You need somewhere to put your beginning. If your culture lives in a flat, river-fed plain, you don't have a sacred mountain like Olympus or Sinai looming in the distance. Your horizons are reeds and low mounds. The most awe-inspiring things in your daily life are the sky and the water. The sky is the realm of gods like An and Enlil. You can't build there. But the water that you can touch, shape, tame with canals, lift with shadoofs, pour into fields, drink, and fear when it overflows. The idea that, at one specific point in the plain, the whole cosmic freshwater ocean wells up close to the surface, under a god's house gives you a natural origin point. In other words, Eridu is not first because a census taker checked the dates of foundation. It is first because it works as a starting place in a symbolic geography. This is where the archaeology and the tradition overlap in an interesting way. From a strictly archaeological point of view, Eridu is certainly among the earliest large settlements in southern Mesopotamia. Its earliest temple phases are older than the monumental temples at Uruk. Some scholars have even called it the earliest city in the world, though that depends on how you define city, and other sites elsewhere on the globe can make similar claims. But archaeology also tells us that Eridu was not uniquely alone on a featureless plain. Other early villages and proto-cities were sprouting along ancient river and canal lines. Some of them, like Uruk, would eventually dwarf Eridu in size and influence. Yet, the Sumerian tradition does not start kingship at Uruk. It starts at Eridu. One way to understand this is to see the first city claim as part of how cities competed with each other in stories, as well as in trade and war. Each major centre in southern Mesopotamia liked to think of itself as special. Nippur was special because it held the main cult of Enlil, the god who, in many traditions, presided over the assembly of gods and granted kingship. Uruk was special because it was the city of Inanna and of Gilgamesh, with great walls and heroic legends. Hur was special as the city of the moon god Nanna and the later royal cemeteries. Eridu's claim was different. It did not, in the historical period, dominate the political scene. By the early second millennium it had declined, but it could claim primacy of a different sort, temporal and cosmological primacy. We were first. Our god's house is where the world's fresh water comes from. This is where kingship came down the first time. If you are a priest in Eridu, your mythic capital is that your temple is not just another cult center. It is the hinge between cosmic levels. That gives weight to the idea that kingship first resided there. If rule is a sacred gift, it makes sense that the first recipient sits closest to the deep source of divine power. This is why origin stories and political claims are entangled. When a text says kingship was in Eridu, it is doing more than remembering an old city. It is also giving you a picture of how urban life itself is supposed to relate to the gods and to the structure of the universe. Cities are not random accidents of population density. They are, in this way of thinking, deliberate installations. The gods choose a spot, drop kingship there, and humans build upward from that sacred starting point. The act of founding or rebuilding a city is a ritual act of aligning earthly walls and gates with a cosmic blueprint. In Mesopotamian building rituals we see traces of this. Foundation deposits are buried under temple corners, tiny figurines, inscribed pegs, miniature tools, plaques naming the king who built or restored the house for his god. Deep below the visible floor the past is layered in. When later kings rebuild, they dig down, find older deposits, and sometimes boast about having restored the original foundations as in ancient times. For Eridu, the ancient times are not just a few generations back. They reach into the pre-flood age. In some flood stories, Eridu functions as the oldest of the sacred cities, the place where the divine decrees that make civilization possible are collected and stored. The god Enki, sitting in his watery house there, is described as the keeper of the abstract powers or ordinances that govern everything from kingship and priesthood to weaving and music. The list form appears again, but on a cosmic scale. Civilization as a bundle of divine permissions, kept in a temple built on the lip of the deep. Now, if you remember that the Mesopotamian flood is imagined as water rising from below, as well as falling from above, Eridu's watery symbolism starts to blur into flood symbolism. The same deep that feeds fresh water into the city's wells and canals is, in myth, also one of the sources of the deluge. In some texts, the Apsu is disturbed or opened. The boundaries between the ordered world and the primeval waters fail, and the result is catastrophic flooding. To live in Eridu or in any of the southern cities fed by its rivers and canals would be to live with a constant practical awareness of that dual nature of water. It is life. It can also erase everything. The Temple of Enki, the god who both governs the Abzu and, in some flood stories, quietly helps a human hero survive, stands right at that threshold. He embodies in a single divine personality both the structured life-giving order of irrigation and the dangerous boundary-breaking power of the deep. So when later scribes and storytellers imagine a great flood that sweeps over the world, they are not inventing the imagery from nowhere. They are drawing on a mental map in which cities like Eridu are already perched on the edge of the deep, protected and yet threatened by the same invisible waters. How much of this is theological geography, a carefully arranged sacred landscape that expresses ideas about gods and order, and how much is dim historical memory? Interpretations vary. One possibility is that Eridu's first city status is almost entirely theological. In this view, placing kingship there before the flood is like putting Eden at the beginning of the Bible. It is a deliberate narrative move. The earliest phase of human order belongs near the freshest, most primordial source of life. Another possibility is that traditions about Eridu preserve a blurred memory of older settlement patterns. As sea levels and river courses shifted over millennia, some early occupied areas may have been drowned, silted over or abandoned. Eridu, sitting on an early shoreline and retaining continuous ritual importance, could have become a kind of stand-in for a whole phase of lowland life that later people only half remembered. A more cautious reading is that both are at work. Eridu is archaeologically old. It is cultically important as Enki's city. Over time, those facts get wrapped in story, amplified and stylized, until oldest known temple mound becomes first city and temple over a high water table becomes house of the cosmic deep. However we weigh those options, the role Eridu plays in pre-flood traditions is clear. It gives the story a place to begin. Not just a date, but a location where heaven meets earth, meets the waters below, where kingship first touches down, where the gifts that make urban life possible are imagined as having been gathered. From that starting place, kingship can move. Other cities can rise, make their own claims, tell their own stories. And eventually the waters that fed Eridu's canals can swell beyond their bounds in the great flood that will mark the end of that first age. To meet the first-named survivor of that transition, we have to leave Eridu's temple mound and travel up the King List to another city on the edge of the water, the last of the pre-flood towns, a place called Shuruppak and a figure named Ziusudra. Shuruppak sits at the other end of that pre-flood sequence. In the King List, after Eridu and a chain of antediluvian cities, we read, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, kingship was in Kish. Between those two lines, the flood swept over and kingship was in Kish, there is a gap, a silence that later stories rush to fill. The oldest surviving version of that in Sumerian gives us a name, Ziusudra. His story comes to us on broken clay, from a tablet discovered at Nippur and copied sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE. The language is Sumerian, already a literary and scholarly tongue by then, taught in scribal schools. But the tale it preserves is probably older. How much older? We do not know. This is where earliest has to be used with care. Ziusudra is the earliest flood hero whose story we can still read in his own cultural terms in Sumerian, with at least some continuity of plot. That does not mean his is the first flood story ever told in Mesopotamia, or that he is the oldest version of this character. It simply means that, among the texts that have happened to survive the last 4,000 years of fires, floods, looting and decay, his tablet is the oldest one that still lets us hear the story with more than just a name. And even that hearing is partial. The tablet is broken at top and bottom. Key lines are missing. We have beginnings of sentences without ends, references to speeches whose full wording is gone. What we can reconstruct is more like listening through a cracked door than being inside the room. Still, certain elements stand out. The story begins, as flood stories so often do, with a divine decision. The gods hold a council. In the Sumerian text, it is not fully clear why they choose to send the flood. The motives that will be elaborated in later Akkadian versions, humans being too noisy, too numerous, disturbing the gods' rest, are not spelled out here in detail, at least in the parts we have. What we do see is that the decision itself seems absolute. The flood is not a local disaster. It is a cosmic reset. In the logic of the tale, it marks the end of a whole era of kings and cities. From there we move to the second essential element, the warning. In Sumerian, the god who plays the role of discreet helper is Enki, the same Enki whose temple at Eridu sits over the deep. The fragmentary lines suggest that Enki, bound by the consensus of the gods, but unwilling to let all life perish, finds a way to get the message to a human in Shuruppak. That human is Ziusudra, described with reverent titles. Pious king, maybe priest king. He is not just any villager. He is a figure already embedded in the network of cities and temples that make up pre-flood order. How exactly Enki warns him is one of those places where the text is badly broken. Later versions from Akkadian will have the god speak through a reed wall, or in a dream. The Sumerian tablet mentions a dream and a god speaking, but the specifics are unclear. We have verbs like listen and heed, and then gaps where the actual command should be. What we can reasonably infer is that Ziusudra is told to build something and to preserve life. There are references to a boat or large vessel, to animals being brought on board, to the seed of humankind. The basic outline is familiar: foreknowledge, construction, boarding, and then the onrush of water. The flood itself in the surviving lines is more implied than described. A line mentions a storm, another speaks of the flood raging for 7 days and 7 nights. Then suddenly we are in the aftermath. Ziusudra has survived. His vessel has come to rest. Here the third core element appears, the post-flood offering. The Sumerian tablet, in its clearest section, describes Ziusudra emerging from his boat and prostrating himself. He makes a libation, he offers sacrifices, the language is liturgical. He bows, he stands in awe, he presents offerings to the gods. In a world where sacrifice is a central act of maintaining cosmic balance, this is not just gratitude. It is an attempt to re-establish the proper channels between human and divine after those channels have been literally washed away. And this is where the Sumerian emphasis becomes especially clear. The climax of the story is not the engineering of the boat, not the terror of the storm, but the ritual that follows. The narrative energy gathers around the moment of worship, the reopening of the vertical line between earth and heaven. The gods, seeing this pious act, respond. In the preserved text, 2 names stand out: An and Enlil, the high gods of sky and wind. They grant Ziusudra life like a god. They set him to live in a remote, pure place, Dilmun or some similarly liminal region that functions as a blessed realm. He becomes more than a survivor. He becomes a figure of transition, the last king of the old world, and, in some traditions, a kind of immortal witness to the passage from pre-flood to post-flood existence. The text closes, so far as we can see it, with a gesture toward restoration. The flood is over. The anger of the gods has subsided. Kingship, which had been interrupted by the cataclysm, will eventually descend from heaven again, this time to Kish. The line of cities will resume, now on the far side of a cosmic boundary. In this way, Ziusudra's story is not only about survival, it is about the continuity of order. His obedience, his offerings, his elevation to an almost divine status act as a bridge between two eras. The world is not simply destroyed and recreated from scratch. A thread is carried across the water in the person of a righteous king who knows how to listen to a god and how to sacrifice correctly when the waters recede. If you compare this to later Akkadian tellings, like Atrahasis or the flood episode embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the family resemblance is obvious, but the tone shifts. In Atrahasis, the narrative lingers on the reasons for the flood. The gods complain about human noise and overpopulation. There is a sense of bureaucratic frustration, of divine policy gone wrong and then patched with famines, plagues, and finally the deluge. In Gilgamesh, the flood survivor, now called Utnapishtim, tells his story in a tone of weary irony. He emphasizes the trick by which Ea Enki gets around the divine oath, the way he speaks to the reed wall instead of to the man directly. The drama centers on deception, on the unevenness of God's decisions, on the bitter knowledge that Utnapishtim gains immortality but cannot share it. The Sumerian Ziusudra text, by contrast, feels more liturgical, more focused on piety than on complaint. We do not hear long arguments among the gods. We do not hear Ziusudra protest or negotiate. What the surviving lines give us is a portrait of a king who obeys, who performs the right rituals at the right time, and who is rewarded with a place beyond ordinary human fate, where Atrahasis invites you to think about the tension between divine needs and human nuisance, and Gilgamesh turns the flood into a meditation on mortality. Ziusudra's tale leans toward the reaffirmation of a sacred pattern. Disaster comes. A specially favoured human is warned. He preserves life, offers sacrifice, and is taken up into a kind of exalted state. Then kingship is re-anchored in the post-flood world. At the same time, we have to keep one eye on the gaps. Because the tablet is so fragmentary, it is tempting to plug those gaps with details from the better preserved Akkadian stories. Scholars sometimes do this cautiously, suggesting that where both later versions agree on a motif, it may echo a common earlier tradition. But responsible historians and philologists are careful about how far they go. When you see a blank where the Sumerian text breaks, and you know that later Ea speaks to a reed wall, it is easy to assume the same device stood there earlier. It might have. It might not. The Sumerian could have imagined a dream, an oracle at a temple, even a direct speech. We simply do not know. Likewise, when the motives for the flood are not clearly stated in Sumerian, it is tempting to import the noisy humans motif backward. Yet that theme itself may have evolved over time, shaped by new theological concerns in old Babylonian society. So, in reconstructing Ziusudra's story, scholars juggle two instincts. One is pattern recognition, noticing the shared skeleton of divine decision, hidden warning, ark, storm, sacrifice, and post-flood blessing across different languages and centuries. The other is restraint, resisting the urge to fill every silence with familiar material, and acknowledging where our knowledge stops. Earliest here, then, is a double reminder. It tells us that Ziusudra's tablet is the oldest nearly coherent flood narrative we can actually read, a precious window into how Sumerian scribes themselves told the story. And it reminds us that even this earliest window is cracked. The light that comes through is real but partial. In that half-light, we can make out a king of Shuruppak standing on newly dried ground, bowing before gods who have just unmade and remade his world, offering the smoke and scent of sacrifice into a sky that for 7 days and nights had been nothing but storm. Soon other traditions will give this figure new names, new speeches, new emotional tones. Atrahasis will wrestle with the problem of being too many. Utnapishtim will speak about the limits of human life to a restless hero named Gilgamesh. But beneath those later layers, the outline of Ziusudra remains, the earliest surviving flood hero whose story still reaches us from the clay. To follow that outline forward, we turn next to the Akkadian world, where the same flood will be told again, this time with a sharper focus on human numbers, divine noise complaints, and the uneasy balance between life and limits. Atrahasis means something like exceedingly wise or extra wise. By the time his story was written down in Akkadian, probably in the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian scribes had already been living with flood traditions for centuries. They had Ziusudra behind them, antediluvian king lists behind them, and a whole web of temple myths about how gods and humans related. Atrahasis takes that inherited material and does something very particular with it. It turns the flood into a management problem. The story opens not with humans, but with gods doing hard labour. In the old Babylonian tablets, the junior gods are out there digging canals, maintaining irrigation works, piling up riverbanks, the kind of back-breaking hydraulic labour that in real Mesopotamian life kept cities alive. The senior gods, the great ones like Enlil, benefit from this work. The juniors do it. Eventually the workers snap. They carry the pickaxe, they dig the canal, they sweat and groan, and then they decide they have had enough. They surround Enlil's house in a kind of divine labour riot, torches in hand. This is not a silent cosmic decree, it is a mutiny. Enlil is furious, but another god, Enki Ea, proposes a solution: relieve the gods of this toil by creating a new kind of worker, humans. A goddess associated with birth, often called Mami or Nintu, is brought in. A divine council convenes. They mix clay with the blood of a sacrificed god, a rebel whose life is literally turned into labour power. From that mixture, humans are formed. The setup is stark. In this telling, humans are designed from the beginning as a labour force to take over the canal digging, field tending, temple maintaining tasks that the lesser gods no longer want. Human existence is framed as a response to a strike. At first, the arrangement seems to work. People flourish. They dig the canals, plant the fields, present offerings. The gods are relieved. They now receive food and worship without having to do the heavy lifting themselves. But the text doesn't leave it there. The problem that emerges is not laziness, but success. Humans multiply. The land fills with them, and with people comes noise. The Akkadian word used for this is sometimes translated as clamour, uproar, or noise, but it carries a sense of constant, unceasing disturbance. The kind of background hum a city makes when it never really sleeps. For Enlil, the high god of wind and authority, the clamour becomes unbearable. He cannot rest. He cannot sleep his night because the human world is too loud. Here, something important happens. The motive for catastrophe is not human wickedness in a moral sense. No great catalogue of sins is read out, no list of crimes. Instead, we get a kind of divine nuisance complaint. There are too many of them, they are too noisy. They disturb the gods. It is a strangely bureaucratic irritation, and it feels very much like a story told by people who live in crowded cities, under officials who worry about numbers, rations, and the management of populations. In response, Enlil does not jump straight to the flood. Atrahasis is careful to show an escalation, a sequence of policy measures. First, the gods send plague. Human numbers drop, but Enki quietly warns Atrahasis, his wise servant, and gives him instructions to counteract the disaster: proper rituals, appeals to the right gods, ways to restore health. The plan fails. The population recovers. Next come drought and famine. Again, Enlil tries to thin out humanity. Again, Enki subverts the plan by teaching Atrahasis how to appease the gods, how to survive on limited resources, how to ride out the crisis. Each time, the divine attempt to control numbers is undermined by a sympathetic insider who values human life and ingenuity. Finally, Enlil calls the council and decides on something more absolute. No more piecemeal measures, no more localized disasters. This time, a total flood. Now, in Atrahasis, the tension is explicit. The gods swear an oath not to disclose the plan. Enki is bound by that oath, yet he cannot stand by and watch his human creation, his clever servant Atrahasis, be wiped out, so he finds a loophole in the text. He speaks not to Atrahasis, but to the wall of his reed house. He addresses the architecture, not the man, and gives instructions that the human can overhear without the god technically breaking his sworn silence. The warning is detailed. Atrahasis is told to dismantle his house and build a boat to abandon his property, his social place, and turn everything into a vessel. He is instructed on dimensions, sealing, loading. In some recensions, we get language about covering the boat with pitch, about bringing on the seed of all living creatures. The very act of building is already a kind of argument against Enlil's totalizing decree. There is a counter-project, a finite enclosed space where life can be preserved. Not to outgrow limits, but to carry a carefully curated fragment of the old world through a season of annihilation. When the flood comes in Atrahasis, it is devastating. The waters cover the land. The storm rages. Humanity is drowned. But the text lingers on something else as well, the reaction of the gods. They are not aloof. The mother goddess, Mummy, mourns her children. She weeps over the corpses floating in the water. She regrets the destruction. The gods, cut off from sacrifices and offerings, grow hungry. They crowd around Atrahasis's post-flood sacrifice like flies in a vivid image that later appears in Gilgamesh too. This is revealing. The gods need humans not just as labourers, but as worshippers, as providers of food in the sacrificial economy. Total extermination is bad policy. When Enlil discovers that there are survivors, he is enraged. The text, as far as we have it, shows a heated exchange between him and Enki. Enlil accuses Enki of betrayal. Enki argues that indiscriminate destruction was excessive, that wiser management was possible. What emerges from their compromise is crucial. Instead of trying to wipe humans out entirely whenever numbers grow too high, the gods impose structural limits on human life: shorter lifespans, high infant mortality, periodic celibacy for certain classes of women, a priestesshood whose members by status do not bear children, built-in brakes on exponential growth. Atrahasis, in other words, reframes the flood not as a one-time moral judgment, but as the dramatic moment after which the human condition is permanently altered. We live shorter lives. We experience loss. Some people are set aside for religious service and so do not reproduce. These are explained as features of a new divine population policy. For ancient listeners, this would not have been abstract. They lived in cities where scribes counted rations and heads of household, where kings boasted of making the land numerous and then lamented famine, where temple institutions regulated marriage and sexual behaviour. Scholars reading Atrahasis have noticed how much of this feels like commentary on that world. Some see the whole narrative as a kind of theological satire, a portrayal of gods who are powerful but short-sighted, whose noisy complaints and clumsy solutions mirror the frustrations of human rulers trying to manage overcrowded cities and scarce resources. Others read it more as priestly worldview. On that reading, Atrahasis justifies the existing order. Yes, humans die young. Yes, not everyone can marry and have children. Yes, disasters come. But these are part of a divinely instituted system, born out of the need to keep the world in balance after an earlier crisis pushed things too far. There is also a quieter, more psychological way to see it. The story takes the raw, frightening fact that humans die, that children are lost, that lives are limited, and it wraps those facts in narrative. It says, this is not just random cruelty. This is the outcome of a negotiation between gods who learned the hard way that absolute control and total destruction are self-defeating. Within that frame, Atrahasis himself functions as more than just a hero who survives. He is the model human who listens to a warning, who obeys instructions that go against common sense, building a boat where no sea is visible, and who preserves a remnant through obedience and craft. His boat is not only an ark, it is an argument in wood and pitch that life should continue, but within limits. Later flood tales will inherit this logic in different keys. Gilgamesh will place the emphasis on the irony of immortality granted to one man and denied to all others. Biblical traditions will turn the flood into a story of moral corruption and covenant. But Atrahasis sits in between Ziusudra's liturgical piety and Utnapishtim's weary irony, giving the Mesopotamian flood a distinctly administrative flavour. Too many people, too much noise, too much strain on the system. A council meeting, a series of failed interventions, a catastrophic reset. And then, in the quiet after the waters recede, new rules written into the fabric of human life. In that sense, Atrahasis is not only about what happened once, long ago, when the world was washed clean. It is about why, even now, we are never allowed to be too many, too loud, too limitless for very long. By the time we meet the flood again, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story has moved into a different kind of frame. It's no longer just about divine policy and population management. It's about one restless king who cannot accept that he will die. In the standard Old Babylonian and later First Millennium versions, the flood appears not at the beginning of the world, but late in Gilgamesh's own story, as a tale told to him by someone who has already lived through it. A story within a story, a memory wrapped in a quest. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, has already accomplished what humans are supposed to admire. He has built walls, founded temples, subdued monsters. He has gone into the cedar forest with his friend Enkidu and cut down trees that were guarded by a terrifying being. And then Enkidu dies. That death is the turning point. Gilgamesh looks at his friend's body and realizes, perhaps for the first time, that the same thing waits for him. Worms, decay, silence. The text lets us watch his panic. He tears off his fine clothes, roams the steppe in animal skins, refuses to accept what every Mesopotamian knew. The life you seek, you will not find. Instead, he decides to look for someone who did. Somewhere, human rumour says, there is a man to whom the gods granted life without end. A man who did not die when everyone else drowned. A man named Utnapishtim. So the flood doesn't just appear on its own. It is summoned by a question. Is it possible to escape the fate fixed for all humans? When Gilgamesh finally reaches Utnapishtim, after dangerous journeys through mountains of darkness and along the shores of the waters of death, he finds not a shining god, but an old man living in a far-off place at the mouth of the rivers. Gilgamesh is astonished. "You do not look different from me," he says in many translations. "You are like me. How is it that you stand in the assembly of the gods and have life?" That question, why one man, why not me, is the hook that pulls the flood narrative into the poem. To answer it, Utnapishtim does something that Atrahasis never gets to do. He speaks in the first person. He begins to tell his story, how, long ago in the city of Shuruppak on the banks of the Euphrates, the gods decided to send a flood to destroy humankind. How the gods swore secrecy. How Ea, the clever god who favours humans, again found a way around the oath. The motifs are familiar, but sharpened for a new purpose. Divine secrecy appears as a kind of barrier between worlds. The gods hold councils in private. Human ears are not supposed to hear. The decree of the flood is one such secret, and the very act of leaking it becomes momentous. In Gilgamesh's version, Ea famously speaks to the reed wall. "Reed wall, reed wall, reed wall, pay attention," he says. "Man of Shuruppak, son of Ubar-Tutu, tear down your house and build a boat." The legalistic dodge from Atrahasis survives, but here it feels more like a riddle than a bureaucratic loophole. The god is obeying the letter of the oath and breaking its spirit. The survivor is being drawn into a conspiracy of preservation. Then come the instructions. They are strangely precise and strangely impossible. Make the boat a perfect cube. Some copies say its length equal to its width and its height. Seal it with pitch inside and out. Load onto it the seed of all living creatures, your family, your craftsmen, your animals, your wealth. The absurd dimensions, which would not actually make a stable ship, tell us something about the story's priorities. The vessel is not an engineer's blueprint. It is a symbol of totality. In its cramped, impossible geometry, the whole pre-flood world is being packed into a box. As Utnapishtim speaks, the emotional temperature of the narrative shifts. We hear not only about measurements and materials, but about what it felt like to obey. He must tell his neighbours something when they see him tearing down his house and building a strange, tar-covered structure on dry land. In some versions, Ea gives him a cover story. Say that Enlil is angry with you and you must go live with your god. There is a muted social tragedy here. Utnapishtim cannot tell his city what is coming. He cannot save them. His survival depends on secrecy. The ark is built under a cloud of half-truths, with workers who do not know they are crafting their own exclusion. Then the storm comes. In Gilgamesh, the language for this is intense. The text leans on similes of war and cosmic violence. The storm god, Adad, thunders. The darkness is total. The wind howls, even the gods themselves, seeing the devastation they have unleashed, are described as cowering, like dogs in heaven, pressed against the wall. The sea rises. People, houses, temples, everything is swept away. Utnapishtim, sealed in his ark, can feel the boat lurching and hear the screaming outside, but he cannot open the door. This is where the emotional texture deepens. The flood is not just a plot device, it is an irreversible boundary. Before there was a city, a household, a web of obligations. After, there will be a lone boat on a silent ocean, and the knowledge that everyone you once knew is gone. The story invites the listener to imagine being in that enclosed space, trapped between obedience and helplessness. When the waters finally calm, the tone changes again. Utnapishtim opens a window, light enters, the text pauses on the quiet. The boat has grounded on a mountain, Nisir in some versions. Days pass as he releases birds, a dove, a swallow, a raven. The first two come back, there is no place to land. The third does not return, the world has reappeared in some form. He steps out, offers a sacrifice, and once more the gods gather like flies over the smell of roasting meat. The scene echoes Atrahasis, but in Gilgamesh it turns toward a different conclusion. Enlil is again furious to discover survivors. Ea again scolds him for overreacting. Again, there is talk of more precise ways to control human excess. Lions, wolves, famine, plague, rather than total annihilation. But then something unique happens. The great gods approach Utnapishtim and his wife, touch their foreheads, and speak a blessing that no other human receives. Until now, Utnapishtim was human, they say in some reconstructions. Now Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like us, the gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers. Immortality, in this telling, is not a general human condition restored after the flood. It is a one-off exception, a reward perhaps for obedience and for having carried life through destruction, or a kind of divine experiment. What happens if one pair is allowed to step across the boundary that now confines all other mortals? From Gilgamesh's perspective, this is the worst news. The very existence of Utnapishtim proves that the gods can grant unending life, and that they have chosen, deliberately, not to make it normal. Surviving the deluge becomes the origin story of a permanent inequality. One man beyond death, everyone else subject to it. That is why the flood episode hurts in a different way than Atrahasis. In Atrahasis, the emphasis falls on new rules, shortened lives, priestesses who do not bear children, limits built into the species. The flood is a hinge that explains why human experience is the way it is. In Gilgamesh, the same catastrophe is reframed as an existential contrast. The flood is the moment when the gods drew a line and then allowed a single human to step over it. That step is not repeatable. Gilgamesh cannot go back in time and be the one with the boat. He can only listen to the story and hear, in Utnapishtim's tired voice, that there will be no second chance. Even the way Utnapishtim tells it carries a different mood. He is not a heroic founder establishing population policy. He is an exile recounting a trauma. His immortality feels less like a prize and more like an endless afterward. The world before the flood, with its city and its friendships, is gone. He lives forever, but not in the place or with the people he once knew. The poem underlines this by following the flood tale, with tests that Gilgamesh fails. Utnapishtim challenges him to stay awake for 6 or 7 days, to master even sleep, the little brother of death. Gilgamesh cannot. Bread loaves baked for each day pile up beside him as proof. Then, as a kind of consolation, Utnapishtim reveals a plant that can restore youth if brought back to Uruk. Gilgamesh finds it, names it, dreams of sharing it with his people. On the way home, while he is bathing, a snake steals it. The pattern is deliberate. Each time a door to renewed life opens, it closes. Each time Gilgamesh reaches for an exception, the story pulls him back toward the common human condition. What then is this flood episode doing inside the epic? On one level, it may preserve cultural memory of real riverine disasters, sudden overflows of the Tigris or Euphrates, catastrophic inundations that buried fields and villages. Some scholars think the repeated Mesopotamian flood stories are echoes of such events, amplified and universalized. On another level, it is clearly a literary meditation. By the old Babylonian period, scribes were reworking earlier traditions for new audiences. They took the broad structure of Atrahasis, the noisy humans, the angry gods, the secret warning, the ark, the storm, and adapted it to explore a different question. Not why are we limited, but how do we live knowing we are? The result is a narrative where disaster and mortality are intertwined. The flood becomes the moment when the gods had the power to erase everything and chose instead to let a fragile thread of life continue under new terms. Those terms include a single immortal survivor, whose presence makes everyone else's death feel sharper. For listeners drifting towards sleep, there is something strangely calming in the way the story resolves. Gilgamesh does not find a way around the boundary. He returns to Uruk, not with eternal life, but with a clearer sense of what he does have. His city, its walls, his name, the stories that will be told about him. The flood and Utnapishtim's weary testimony do not remove death. They frame it. They say there was a time when everything was almost lost. One man speaks from that edge. The fact that you are here to hear him means the world went on, but not as it was. When Utnapishtim says that he stood in the assembly of the gods, he is not speaking metaphorically. For Mesopotamian audiences, the divine world was imagined on the model of a court. There is a high throne surrounded by lesser thrones and benches. There is an agenda. There are debates, accusations, concessions. At key moments in Atrahasis, in the Sumerian flood poems, and in Gilgamesh, we're told that the great gods sat in council, or took counsel together, or fixed a decree. The decision to send the flood is one such decree. It is not the whim of a single isolated deity. It emerges from a kind of heavenly cabinet meeting. Enlil, often the most powerful figure in these scenes, is the one who pushes hardest for drastic action. In Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, Enlil is the god of air and authority, the bearer of the Tablet of Destinies in some myths, the one who grants kingship to cities. He is quick to anger when the human population grows noisy, when ritual order feels threatened. But he is not alone. Anu, the distant sky god, often appears as an overarching authority, sometimes silent, sometimes concurring. Enki, called Ea in Akkadian, sits there too, the god of deep waters, craft and cunning. In flood narratives, he is the one who sympathizes with humans, who finds legal or rhetorical ways to bend the rules. Storm gods like Adad or Ishkur stand ready to carry out the physical destruction. Thunder, wind, floodwater. In some lists, goddesses of wisdom and birth, Nintu, Belatili, sometimes Ishtar, are also present, and they are the ones who mourn when death goes too far. They had fashioned humanity as workers for the gods. Watching those workers drown, they cry out that they have undone their own design. So the council is a mix of forces: authority, enforcement, cleverness, compassion. The texts do something interesting with this. They let these divine figures disagree. In Atrahasis, Enlil complains about noise and overpopulation. He wants silence and control. Ea warns that killing everyone is a bad policy. After the flood, the mother goddess laments the corpses and insists that this must not happen again. In Gilgamesh, Enlil is outraged to discover a survivor. He demands to know who leaked the secret. Ea deflects, argues, scolds him for overkill. Why a flood, when you could have sent wolves, famine, plagues, partial measures instead of erasure? For a modern listener used to ideas of an all-knowing singular deity, this internal debate may feel surprising. For the Mesopotamian world, it seems to have been one way of making sense of a universe that felt orderly and fragile at the same time. If the gods can argue, then misfortune does not have to mean that reality itself is broken. It may mean that one aspect of divinity has prevailed over another. The stormy, punitive side has, for a time, won out over the wise, moderating side. That, in turn, allows the stories to ask questions about justice. Was it right to send the flood? The poems never answer with a clear yes. They dramatize divine regret instead. Gods cower during the storm. Goddesses wail afterward. Ea's speech to Enlil in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh reads almost like a legal indictment. You went too far. There were other tools available. Justice, in this picture, is not a static cosmic fact. It is something argued over even in heaven. The way those arguments happen is bound up with oaths and secrecy. When the council decides on the flood, they swear not to reveal it. The oath is serious enough that Ea cannot simply walk down to Shuruppak and tell Atrahasis or Utnapishtim what's coming. Instead, he uses what we might call narrative workarounds. He speaks to a wall. He addresses a dream. He encodes his warning in a riddle. I did not reveal the secret of the great gods to a human, he later tells the angry assembly. I only spoke to a wall. This is playful, but it is also precise. An oath in Mesopotamian culture is a binding speech act. Law codes and treaties are filled with them. Once you swear by the gods, breaking your word threatens the fabric of both society and cosmos. Ea's cleverness is depicted as a way of honouring the form of the oath, while subverting its outcome. The same logic appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian thought. Fate, what is decreed, is powerful. But there is room at the edges. Incantation priests specialise in undoing curses, without openly overturning the gods' decisions. Diviners read the will of heaven in livers and stars, not to change destiny, but to navigate within it. In the flood tales, this tension becomes a narrative engine. The decree of total destruction has been fixed. Within that decree, one shrewd god, and one receptive human carve out a tiny pocket of survival. From another angle, these stories are showing us a familiar human experience, living under rules you did not make, trying to find small spaces of choice. The link between divine counsel and earthly institutions is not subtle. Kingship in Mesopotamia is often described as descending from heaven. When the Sumerian King List talks about the pre-flood rulers, it presents their authority as something handed down from gods like Enlil. Royal inscriptions from later periods imagine the king as standing in a kind of junior version of the heavenly assembly, taking counsel, issuing decrees, consulting omens. Temple communities are the local mirror of this cosmic bureaucracy. Each great city has its patron god housed in a temple with priests, scribes, administrators. Offerings are brought the way taxes are brought to a palace. Legal disputes are sometimes settled before the god, with oaths sworn in his or her name. Just as the gods sit in council to decide fate, temple and palace councils sit to decide cases, assign labour, allocate grain. The flood narratives, with their scenes of divine politics, can be read as reflecting and perhaps gently commenting on these human arrangements. Enlil's harshness looks, in part, like the severity of real rulers who respond to complexity with force. Ea's evasions echo the ingenuity of officials and advisors who know how to bend rules to avoid catastrophe. The mourning goddess resembles those in a community who bear the tangible cost of policies made far above them. Different modern interpreters have emphasized different aspects of this. Some read the texts primarily as theology, attempts to think through how multiple divine powers interact, how mercy and anger and wisdom and storm fit together in a single cosmos. Others see strong political allegory. In this view, the divine assembly is a safe way to talk about actual courts and councils. Criticizing Enlil's overreaction may be a veiled way of saying that unrestrained kings can ruin their own people. Still others focus on narrative convention. In many ancient epics, gods in council serve as a kind of stage where the big plot turns are decided. The quarrels, oaths and loopholes are mechanisms to keep the story moving, to explain why disaster is coming and how one hero manages to slip through. These readings are not mutually exclusive. For a Mesopotamian listener, drifting off to the murmur of a recited poem, the Council of the Gods could have been all of these things at once, a picture of how the universe is ordered, a shadow of how their own city was run, and a familiar storytelling pattern that made sense of sudden, overwhelming change. What matters for the flood tradition is that the cosmos is not random. There are rules. Some are written into the way things are. Humans work, gods feed, rivers rise and fall. Others are hammered out in meetings, decrees of destruction, promises not to repeat a mistake, extraordinary blessings for a single survivor. And within that web of rules there is always a little room for a crafty god to whisper to a wall, for one attentive person to hear, for a boat to rise on waters that were meant to wash everything away. In the next part of the story, the focus shifts from councils and decrees to something that puzzled ancient scribes as much as it intrigues modern readers: the extraordinary lifespans and huge numbers that hover over the world before the flood. Before the flood, everything is larger, not just in drama, but in duration. If you look back at the Sumerian King List, when it turns its gaze to the antediluvian world, the numbers suddenly jump into a different register. Kings don't rule for decades, they rule for tens of thousands of years. After the kingship descended from heaven, the text says, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it gives us the first ruler, Alulim, and tells us he reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalga, for 36,000. After them come more names, spread across other early cities: Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, with reign lengths like 43,200 years, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. By the time the list reaches the line, then the flood swept over, 8 kings have sat on their thrones for a combined 241,200 years. This is not an isolated Sumerian quirk. Later Mesopotamian traditions keep playing with the same sense of scale. Babylonian lists of antediluvian sages attach them to very ancient kings and imply similarly deep spans of time. Outside Mesopotamia, the pattern repeats. In the Hebrew Bible, the patriarchs from Adam to Noah consistently live for centuries, with Methuselah topping out at 969 years. In some Hellenistic traditions about Babylon, preserved by the writer Berosus, there are 10 pre-flood kings who rule for a grand total of 432,000 years. These are not numbers that fit into ordinary experience. They are not meant to. So what are they doing? One line of explanation starts with mathematics. The scribes who wrote and recopied these texts thought in base 60, a sexagesimal system. 60 was a kind of magic number, divisible by many smaller integers, useful for keeping track of time and angles, favoured for practical calculation, and for symbolic play. When you see reigns like 28,800 or 36,000 years, patterns emerge. Both are neat multiples of 60. The total 241,200 years for the 8 pre-flood kings in the Sumerian list is also a tidy construction when you break it down into 60s and larger units built from them. Some scholars argue that these reigns are not meant to be read as real chronological spans at all, but as numerological structures. They might be built up from combinations of sacred numbers, astronomical cycles, or calendar units. The enormous figures could encode repeating patterns of months, years, or ritual periods, then be expressed in years for narrative convenience. There is a related idea sometimes called mythic time. In mythic time, you are not measuring how many springs passed in the way a farmer would. You are mapping importance. The further back you go, the more charged the world becomes. The gods walk more openly. Cities are closer to their divine patrons. Heroes perform first-time acts. To express that distance from the present, traditions reach for duration that feels qualitatively different. Ages, aeons, reigns that last so long, they stop being mere numbers and start being a way of saying, this was another order of reality. You can hear a faint echo of this even in modern speech. We talk about the age of dinosaurs as if it were a single long moment, though it lasted over 100 million years, and about the long 19th century as a kind of extended mood that bleeds past its calendar bounds. The pre-flood lifespans in Sumer or in Genesis may be doing something similar. They stretch the lives of kings and ancestors so far that they almost merge with the landscape. They become part of an age thickness that separates the present world from whatever existed before the waters. Still, the numbers themselves are too specific to dismiss as pure vagueness. Why 8 kings before the flood in Sumer? Why 10 in Genesis and in Berosus? Why totals like 241,200 years or 432,000 years instead of simply thousands and thousands? One proposal is that these figures compress long dynastic sequences into single names. Imagine a city where the throne passes through one family line generation after generation, with each king taking on a throne name, call it Alulim. Over centuries, outsiders might remember that Alulim ruled there for a very long time. A king list produced much later could then treat Alulim as a single ruler and give him the whole stretch. If that stretch is being tracked using calendar cycles, say combinations of 60-year periods or larger symbolic units, then it is easy for it to balloon into mythical-sounding totals when converted back into years. A related idea is that the lists encode something like the rise and fall of cities. In this reading, Eridu, 2 kings. They ruled for 64,800 years does not mean 2 individuals with astonishing medical records. It means there was an Eridu-dominated age, whose extent is being expressed through a ritual or numerological lens. When kingship later returns to Kish or goes to Uruk, the list marks that change with a new set of rulers and another block of exorbitant time. Other scholars look to astronomy. A total like 432,000 years in Berossus can be broken into 120 saroi of 3,600 years each, with those saroi themselves multiples of 60. Some have suggested that such structures mirror celestial cycles, movements of planets, precession of equinoxes, repeating configurations in the sky, translated into narrative history. The antediluvian kings, in this view, are a way of mapping cosmic rhythms onto political memory. We should be cautious here. The temptation to find hidden codes everywhere is strong, and the surviving evidence is thin. It is entirely possible that some of these clever numerical reconstructions tell us more about modern preferences than ancient practice. The texts themselves rarely pause to explain their arithmetic. What they do show us is genre. Ancient Near Eastern king lists often exaggerate early reign lengths, then gradually shrink them as they move closer to the present. This pattern appears not just in Sumerian materials, but in later Assyrian and Babylonian records, and in other cultures influenced by them. The remote past is populated by rulers with impossibly long lives. The nearer you come to the scribe's own time, the more mundane the numbers become. Inflation seems to be a signal. We are now in the realm of beginnings. Seen this way, the pre-flood section of the Sumerian King List is doing what many traditions do. It is marking the border between mythic and historical time using the tool it knows best, numbers. It is saying, without argument, that before the Great Watershed event, the scale of existence was not like ours. Can we peel back the symbolism and recover a precise chronology from those vast totals? Probably not. We can suggest that the lists remember real cities, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Shuruppak, and perhaps dim recollections of dynasties and regional hegemonies. We can note the base 60 patterns and the parallels to other traditions. We can hypothesize that some of these reigns disguise calendar cycles or astronomical schemes. But beyond that, the numbers remain opaque. They stand there on the clay, cool and unwavering, inviting interpretation and resisting certainty. For the people who heard them recited, drifting towards sleep in temple courtyards or in quiet houses, that may have been the point. The vast ages before the flood were not a puzzle to be solved. They were a mood, a reminder that their own lives, measured in fragile decades, hung from a story that claimed to run back through kings who ruled for thousands upon thousands of years in a world that would eventually be washed away. In the next part, we step inside that world as the texts describe it and ask a different question. Before the waters rose, what did they imagine daily life was for? If you follow the thread of those pre-flood traditions, you start to notice something. For all the talk of impossible lifespans, of kingship descending from heaven, and ages lasting for hundreds of thousands of years, the actual scenes the texts linger on are surprisingly practical. They talk about founding cities. They talk about building temples. They talk about assigning kingship and dividing up work. In the Sumerian King List, when kingship first descends from heaven, it doesn't fall on a wandering band in open country. It lands in Eridu, already imagined as a city, already the seat of a temple for the god Enki. Later texts about Eridu describe its antediluvian state as a kind of sacred prototype. Canals already cut, rituals already established, the god already enthroned in his shrine. In some versions of the tradition, the first things the gods teach humans are not grand philosophical truths. They teach them how to lay out bricks, how to dig irrigation ditches, how to organize a labor force so grain can be grown, harvested, and brought into storehouses under the supervision of temple officials and kings. Even when the stories pull back to cosmic scale, they keep circling these same points. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods themselves begin as the labourers. They dig the canals, maintain the fields, and dredge the riverbeds. After 40 years of this, they revolt. They surround the house of Enlil at night, torches in hand, complaining of endless work and no rest. The Divine Council's solution is not to abolish the work, but to change who does it. Humans are created as a labour force. They will take over the digging and carrying. The gods will receive offerings and live in relative ease. The text is blunt. People exist so that the yoke can be placed on their shoulders, so that the hoe and the basket can be in human hands. It is a stark vision, but also a revealing one. When later Mesopotamians imagined a time before the flood, they did not picture a wild, free Eden. They pictured something closer to their own world, but with the volume turned up. More perfect canals, more orderly cities, kings ruling with divine backing for unthinkably long spans, temples fully supplied. The centre of gravity is not the household, it is the city-temple complex. Agriculture is the quiet engine behind all of this. Southern Mesopotamia is an artificial landscape. Without irrigation, much of it is too dry for reliable farming. With too much water or poor drainage, it becomes a salt-scarred marsh or desert. To imagine a world before the flood is, for these writers to imagine a world in which water is precisely managed. Lists of the me, the divine decrees or cultural powers that Enki and other gods distribute, include things like building cities, establishing the plough, canal inspection, boundary marking, scribal art, truth, and kingship. In other words, the skills and institutions you need to keep an irrigation civilization running. You can hear, underneath the theology, a very human preoccupation. Will the canals silt up? Will the fields get water at the right time? Will there be enough grain? The great disasters feared in these stories are not asteroid impacts or sudden glaciers. They are drought and flood, the two ends of the agricultural nightmare. In Atrahasis, the gods first try to reduce human noise and numbers with plagues, and with a famine engineered by blocking off the canals and the fields. Only later do they resort to the flood. Noise is another recurring concern. The gods complain not just that humans are many, but that they are loud. Their uproar keeps the high god from sleeping. It is an oddly domestic complaint, scaled up to the divine, the world as a crowded city quarter where neighbours are always shouting, singing, quarrelling, calling to animals and children, working at all hours. When you put these details together, a picture starts to form of what daily life was for in the imagination behind these texts. Life is for work that sustains the gods. Life is for maintaining the fragile order that keeps fields watered, cities supplied, temples active. The moral universe implied by the stories is built around this. Humans are made to serve. That point is not hidden, it is stated. But service is not purely one-sided. In Atrahasis, when the gods decide to wipe out humanity with a flood, one god, Enki, subverts the plan. He warns the human hero, speaking to him through a reed wall so he can claim technical obedience to the council's decision. After the waters recede, when offerings are made again, the famished gods gather like flies over the sacrifice. They need the food and incense that human rituals provide. Service is mutual in a skewed way. Humans owe labour and piety. Gods owe at least a minimal protection, or the system risks collapsing. Some texts hint at this tension. Prayers that remind a deity that if their worshippers perish, their own temples will stand empty. Laments that accuse gods of abandoning cities they were supposed to guard. Even so, what is conspicuously missing from the pre-flood material is the small granular detail of ordinary domestic life. We hear almost nothing about how a pre-flood family cooked, what games children played, how disputes were settled between neighbours, what jokes were told over beer. The surviving lines are almost entirely about big structures, city foundations, royal authority, temple rituals, cosmic decisions. That absence is itself a clue. These are ideological narratives. They are not ethnographies of a lost time. They are blueprints and justifications for a particular kind of order. The antediluvian world is presented as a model of how things ought to be. Kingship properly bestowed, temples properly attended, humans fitting into their assigned role in the cosmic division of labour, which makes the choice of a flood as the great turning point feel less arbitrary. A flood in that landscape is not just a lot of water, it is the failure of the entire system. Canals overflow or break. Fields are scoured. Boundaries are erased as river and plain merge into one wide surface. The carefully drawn lines between city and countryside, between cultivated field and wild land, between temple precinct and ordinary street, are washed away. To say, then the flood swept over, is to say that all the work of ordering the world was abruptly undone. After such an event, any return to normalcy has to be a refounding. Kingship must descend again. Cities must be refounded. Temples must be rebuilt. The gods and humans, if they are to go on living together, need a new understanding. The flood in these stories is not only punishment, it is a reset, a chance to renegotiate the balance between human labour, divine expectation, and the noisy, fertile, dangerous abundance that agriculture brings. For listeners hearing these tales in later ages, people whose days were still filled with fields and canals, temple dues and royal decrees, the antediluvian world was not a lost paradise. It was an intensified mirror of their own. The waters that ended it were a warning and perhaps a strange sort of comfort. Even if the order you live in feels permanent, the stories whisper, there was a time when it began, and there can be a time when it is washed clean and begun again. In the next part, we leave the tablets for a moment and turn to the ground itself, to ask how much of this imagined catastrophe might line up with layers of mud and shattered walls, what archaeology can and cannot tell us about a real deluge beneath the stories. When archaeologists go looking for a flood, they are not hunting for a story. They are hunting for changes in dirt. What they can see when they slice down through an ancient mound is a sequence of layers. Occupations where people lived and cooked and dumped their trash tend to leave dark, crumbly soils full of broken pottery, animal bones, hearths, brick fragments. Periods of abandonment might show as a thin wind-blown dust, or as clean sand. A fire can leave a band of ash and baked debris. A flood, if it happened in the right way, leaves its own kind of trace. Fine silts settling out of standing water, water-worn sands. A sudden, relatively clean sheet of river, laid sediment lying right on top of the accumulated rubbish of a city, sometimes with collapsed walls or tilted structures trapped in it. Above that, if people came back, you may see new floors, new houses, new pottery styles, the signature of rebuilding. Sometimes this is very clear, sometimes it is ambiguous. A single layer of silt might come from an unusually rainy season, from a river changing course, from a canal breach. Archaeology is good at saying, something wet happened here. It is less good at saying, this is the flood of Ziusudra. With that in mind, people have nonetheless gone to the famous cities of the flood traditions and asked quietly, is there a scar in the ground that could be the memory behind the myth? Take in the 1920s. When Leonard Woolley was excavating there, his team dug a deep trench down through the city mound. For many metres they passed through the remains of historical buildings, graves, streets. Then they hit a thick band of clean, almost sterile silt, with almost no human debris. Below that, more traces of older habitation. Woolley, working in a time when the Bible stories of Noah and the Mesopotamian flood hero were very much on people's minds, declared that he had found the flood. Newspapers loved it. Here at last was the mud of myth. But even at the time, things were more complicated. The flood layer at was real. It was substantial, several metres in places, and it showed that at some point an enormous inundation had washed over that patch of land, interrupting human occupation. Yet when other archaeologists went to neighbouring sites and dug just as deep, they did not always find the same thing at the same level. Kish to the north did show flood deposits, but they were thinner, and the dating did not line up neatly with Ur's. Shuruppak, the city that later tradition explicitly names as the home of Ziusudra and Utanapishti, produced an especially interesting case. There, excavations uncovered a significant destruction and a layer of flood-laid sediments near the end of the early dynastic period, sometime in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Houses seemed to end abruptly. The overlying levels showed rebuilding with somewhat different material culture. It was tempting again to draw a straight line. Here is Shuruppak, a city described in the stories as destroyed by flood. Here is a flood layer. Surely the one must be the other. But then radiocarbon dates and pottery sequences began to complicate that neat picture. The particular destruction at Shuruppak seemed to be later than what one might expect if it were preserving a very ancient memory behind the Sumerian King List's antediluvian kings. Other cities showed other flood events at other times. Some, like Nippur, have multiple flood deposits separated by centuries. And crucially, when you look across the whole southern Mesopotamian plain, you do not see a single uniform blanket of the same flood layer stretching from city to city all at exactly the same depth and date. Instead, you see a patchwork here, a substantial deposit in one era, there a thinner one sometime earlier or later. Some cities show repeated flood episodes. Others show long periods with little sign of catastrophic inundation. From a geological perspective, this makes sense. Southern Mesopotamia is not a static basin. It is a shifting, braided environment where the Tigris and Euphrates, along with their tributaries and canals, have been wandering back and forth for thousands of years. Channels avulse, suddenly abandon one course and carve a new one. Levees build up and then fail. Low-lying zones become marshes, higher ones remain comparatively dry. A deluge that is catastrophic for one settlement right on a river bend might barely lap the edge of another city, a few kilometres away, built on a slightly higher natural levee. The idea of a single global layer of flood mud, neatly corresponding to a single moment in mythic time, does not sit well with how these river systems actually behave. This does not mean there were no great floods. On the contrary, the archaeological and geological record suggests that southern Mesopotamia has seen many of them, some severe enough to wipe out neighbourhoods or entire towns, to force populations to move, to necessitate wholesale rebuilding. Imagine living in that landscape across centuries. Perhaps your grandparents told you about the year the river rose higher than any elder could remember, when the water pushed over the dikes and tore through the fields, when boats floated where streets had been, and when, after weeks, people returned to find their houses collapsed and their property boundaries erased. Perhaps a generation later there was another, slightly different disaster, a levee failure upstream that sent a wall of water through one quarter of the city, but spared another. Farther north, people in Kish might remember a separate catastrophe, a great inundation that turned their part of the plain into a temporary lake, carrying off livestock and washing offerings out of temple courts. Shuruppak might have its own disaster layer, the year when whatever protections they had failed, and the city did, in fact, suffer something like annihilation by flood. Each of these events leaves a material trace, but it also leaves a story. Over time, as families move, as scribes travel between cities, as priests recite laments and hymns in different temples, the edges of those stories can blur and blend. Instead of the flood that destroyed Shuruppak in the time of such and such king and the terrible high water at in your grandfather's day, you begin to get the Great Flood capitalized in people's minds even if not yet on tablets. It becomes the archetype of all floods, the one that sums them up. In oral tradition, this merging happens easily. Details shift to fit local landscapes. One city becomes the main stage while others become background. A king from one memory is paired with disasters from another. A single wise survivor, whether called Ziusudra, Atrahasis, or Utanapishti, can accumulate the roles of many different real people who, in their own generations, helped communities survive one watery crisis or another. By the time scribes in the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE are writing down the flood stories we know, they are not taking notes on a fresh disaster. They are fixing in clay a mythic pattern that has already been refined by centuries, perhaps millennia, of telling and retelling. Archaeology can confirm that floods were part of that world, that they were serious enough to scar cities and force resets of settlement. It can show, for particular sites, episodes of sudden inundation and rebuilding that resonate eerily with the narrative of a civilization interrupted and then refounded. What it cannot do is point to a band of silt and say with confidence, "This, here, is the moment when the gods gathered in council, resolved to silence human noise, and whispered through a reed wall to warn a single man." The literary narrative, with its divine motives and its carefully arranged sequence of warnings and betrayals, belongs to another kind of evidence. Myths, hymns, epic poems, these are their own archaeological layers, built in language instead of clay. They remember in stylized form a world of real rivers and real floods. But they also reshape that experience to talk about kingship, justice, labour, and the precarious relationship between humans and the powers they imagine above them. So when we set Woolley's trench at next to the lines of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the connection is suggestive but not straightforward. The mud tells us that great waters came and went. The tablets tell us what it felt like in that kind of landscape, to live with the fear that at any moment all your careful ordering could be swept away. Between them, we begin to glimpse a plausible scenario. Not a single world-drowning event, but a long history of regional catastrophes along unstable rivers remembered in overlapping local tales and eventually fused into one canonical flood that stands for them all. In the next part, we follow those fused stories as they travel outward, away from Sumer, across languages and centuries, to become the many different flood traditions that later peoples would call their own. Stories do not sit still once they are written down. They move with people, with tongues, with the steady scratching of pens and reeds. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the main engines of that movement was something very ordinary and very powerful, the scribal school. Imagine a quiet room near a temple courtyard, somewhere in a city like Nippur or Young boys from families with the right connections and resources sit on the floor with moist clay tablets. Beside them, an older scribe dictates or shows them a model text. The students copy the same lines again and again, practicing signs, grammar, and style. At first, they start with simple lexical lists, signs for numbers, names of animals, types of wood, lists of cities and professions. But as they progress, their copywork shifts into literature, proverbs, hymns, incantations, and then eventually the big narratives, the Sumerian King List, the stories of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis myth with its flood, laments over destroyed cities, tales of wise kings and angry gods. Every time a student copies such a text, they help to carry it forward in time. Sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they correct something they think is wrong, or update a name, or harmonize a detail with another version they know. Sometimes a line drops out, sometimes a new one is added from memory or from a different local tradition. Over generations this creates a living tradition, not a frozen one. When a city falls or burns, its scribes may flee to another city, bringing their tablets or only what they remember of them. A library in one place is destroyed by fire or flood, but its contents survive in the minds and copybooks of students trained there who now work elsewhere. This is how motifs spread even within Mesopotamia itself. By the Old Babylonian period, hundreds of years after the earliest Sumerian flood texts were written, we already find flood narratives being recopied, reworked, and woven into different compositions. Ziusudra becomes Utanapishti in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The complaints of the gods about noisy, multiplying humans in Atrahasis echo in later versions of the story. The idea of a divine council deciding on a drastic solution, the motif of one god secretly warning a human, the construction of a special boat, the sending out of birds to test the waters. These elements are not preserved in a single tablet sitting untouched on a shelf. They are kept alive by a culture of continuous copying, and that scribal culture does not stay locked behind one set of city walls. Mesopotamia was crisscrossed by trade routes and political alliances. Caravans carried wool, grain, timber, metals, and lapis lazuli. Along those same routes travelled merchants, messengers, diplomats, and with them, stories. By the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, Akkadian, the Semitic language of empire and trade, was becoming a lingua franca across much of the Near East. Sumerian texts were being translated or adapted into Akkadian. Scribes were bilingual, sometimes trilingual, comfortable moving between languages and scripts. When the rulers of Mari on the Middle Euphrates wrote letters to Babylon, they did it in Akkadian cuneiform. When the Hittite kings in Anatolia copied myths, they often preserved Akkadian originals alongside Hittite translations. At Ugarit, on the Levantine coast, local scribes used their own alphabetic cuneiform, but also knew the broader scribal traditions of the region. In other words, there was a kind of international scribal network. A student trained in Nippur might end up working in the court of a king hundreds of kilometers away. A diplomatic marriage might bring a princess to a foreign capital, along with her personal scribes and her household texts. Conquerors might cart off entire archives as booty, depositing them in their own cities. Within that interconnected world, stories like the Mesopotamian flood did not need a single dramatic export event. They could seep out slowly, through dozens of small channels, a tablet copied here, a story told at a royal banquet there, a local myth rewritten to match fashionable cosmologies from the great cities on the plains. When we compare flood accounts from different parts of the ancient Near East, we see certain patterns. In Sumerian and Akkadian tradition, the gods meet in assembly and decide to send a flood to wipe out humankind. One sympathetic deity warns a chosen man, instructs him to build a boat and to bring aboard his family and animals. The flood comes, destroys cities, and after it recedes, birds are released to test the water. The survivor offers a sacrifice. The gods smell the pleasing odour, regret their severity, and a new arrangement between heaven and earth is established. Later West Semitic traditions preserved, for instance in the Hebrew Bible, show striking parallels. There too, human wrongdoing or human presence becomes intolerable. A deity resolves to send a world-destroying flood. One man is chosen to build a large boat. Animals are brought in. The waters overwhelm the earth. Birds are sent out. A sacrifice follows. And there is a covenant or promise that such a flood will not be repeated. It is tempting to draw a direct line, from Ziusudra to Atrahasis, to Utanapishti to Noah. Some scholars do argue for relatively direct literary dependence of parts of the biblical flood narrative on Mesopotamian models, especially since we know that elites from Judah and Israel encountered Mesopotamian literature during periods of Assyrian dominance and Babylonian exile. But the picture is more complex and more interesting than a simple copy this story into that book. For one thing, there are important differences in detail and meaning. In Atrahasis, the flood is part of a long-running labour dispute between gods and humans. Humans have been created to do work for the gods. When they become too numerous and noisy, the junior gods who have been relieved of labour complain. The flood is one in a sequence of population control measures. Afterward, the solution involves changing human fertility and infant mortality, not a moral covenant. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood story is embedded as a tale told to a king obsessed with his own mortality. It serves as a meditation on the limits of human life and the impossibility of personal immortality. In later Israelite tradition, the flood becomes a moral judgment. Violence and corruption on earth bring divine wrath. The survivor is saved because of righteousness. The post-flood world is tied to ethical expectations and a promise grounded in a single God's character. At the same time, all of these stories likely draw on what we might call a common narrative stock. People living in the wider Near Eastern region shared not only economic and political ties, but also a broad experience of unpredictable rivers, seasonal rains, and catastrophe. Oral traditions about great floods, divine anger, and lucky survivors did not belong exclusively to Sumer or to any one city. So, while Mesopotamian texts give us the earliest written versions of a structured flood myth in this region, they may already be crystallizing themes that circulated more widely in oral form. Later traditions, then, are not simply borrowing a Mesopotamian story wholesale. They are dipping into a shared pool of images and motifs, some of which Mesopotamian scribes had already shaped very powerfully. A divine council debating human fate, a righteous or wise individual singled out, a boat as a microcosm of the world carrying life through chaos, birds as scouts of returning stability, sacrifice as a way of re-establishing communication between earth and the divine. When later authors and communities tell their own flood stories, they may retain some of these building blocks while reassembling them to say something different. New moral emphases, new ideas about covenant, law, or the nature of the gods. New ways of thinking about time, turning a local catastrophe into a cosmic reset. This is where the Mesopotamian texts are especially valuable. They let us see in written form some of the earliest surviving attempts to organize disaster into narrative, to turn a world of dangerous rivers into a story about why kings rule, why humans labor, and how close the line is between order and annihilation. They also give us a baseline for comparison. When we set later flood traditions next to Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Uter-Napishti, we can notice what stays the same and what changes. Sometimes the continuities suggest lines of influence. Sometimes the changes show us how a community has taken the familiar shape of a flood story and filled it with new theological or philosophical content. Instead of imagining a single original story copied faithfully outwards, it may be more accurate to picture a braided river of narrative. Streams from different local experiences, myths and cults merging and separating over centuries. Mesopotamian flood texts are one of the largest and oldest channels in that braided system. Their written form, their preservation in royal and temple libraries, and the reach of Mesopotamian scribal culture help to stabilize certain motifs that then appear and are argued with, echoed, or inverted in later traditions. By listening carefully to those early tablets, we are not just hunting for a source of later myths. We are eavesdropping on an ancient conversation about catastrophe and mercy, justice and survival that would continue in many languages long after the last cuneiform student put down his stylus. And once we start hearing that conversation, another question surfaces quietly. If flood stories can travel so far across empires and religions, what else might be moving with them? Older ideas, half-hidden memories, fragments of a time even the Sumerians already called before the flood. When the Sumerians say before the flood, they are already looking back across a boundary. If we lay their flood texts side by side, the Ziusudra fragment, Atrahasis, the episode in Gilgamesh, the Sumerian King List, certain signals flash over and over. First, there is always an edge, a line you cross and cannot uncross. The gods meet, decide, and something absolute happens. A great deluge that sweeps away cities like reeds. A decision not just to punish, but to reset. Time itself is divided into a before and an after. Second, there is survival, but only by warning. Not by chance, not by being on a hilltop at the right moment, but because someone whispers the plan in advance. Enki talks to a wall, a reed hut, a dream. A human listens, builds, gathers, and rides out the waters. The message is always the same. Disaster is coming, but not everyone has to die, if someone hears in time. Third, there is a rebuilding of order. Once the water falls, the stories do not end with ruin. They move quickly to sacrifice, to agreements, to new rules. In Atrahasis, humans become fewer, more fragile. In Gilgamesh, Utanapishti becomes a kind of exception, placed at the edge of the world. In the King List, kingship descends from heaven once more and history restarts, with new dynasties, new cities, new arrangements. If we strip away the divine names and poetic flourishes, those three moves, boundary, warning, rebuilding, are familiar. They are how communities remember revolutions, invasions, famines, plagues. Something broke. Someone, somewhere, saw it coming. Afterward, the world was put back together, but differently. The Sumerian texts are not just telling a disaster story. They are also doing other work, all at once. On one level, they are about politics. The Sumerian King List is very clear about this. Kingship is a gift from the gods. It belongs in certain cities in a certain sequence. The flood interrupts that chain, but only as a kind of divine audit. When the waters recede, the legitimacy of kingship is renewed. A ruler who can say, "My city's line begins after the flood," is placing himself inside a cosmic timeline that starts with gods, passes through catastrophe, and continues in his person. Scribes in later cities copied and edited that list, sometimes adjusting which dynasty came from where, sometimes extending or trimming reign lengths. They were not just recounting old history, they were arguing very gently that their present masters stood in the correct place in the long story that stretched back before the flood. On another level, the stories served temple ideology. The survivor of the flood almost always ends up building something. An altar, a shrine, a city. The gods, calmed by the smell of sacrifice, re-establish cult centers. When Ziusudra, or Utanapishti, offers a post-flood offering, the text is telling you that ritual is what keeps the world from sliding back into chaos. For a temple community living on the unstable plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, this is a powerful message. Keep the festivals, bring the offerings, maintain the shrines. These actions are not just pious, they are structural. They are the beams and foundations holding back another cosmic flood. And under both of these, beneath the royal ideology and the temple theology, there is probably environmental memory. Southern Mesopotamia was built on river mud. Rivers shifted, banks broke, canals failed. We know from archaeology and sediment cores that the region saw repeated episodes of flooding, channel change, drought, salinization, and even local collapses of settlement. A king who laments that the city was drowned is not speaking entirely in metaphor. The great flood of myth may not match a single global, geologically massive event, but it very likely crystallizes generations of lived experience. Years when the rivers rose too high, seasons when fields vanished under brown water, times when whole towns had to move because the watercourse had abandoned them. Once you notice these layers, it becomes easier and also trickier to think about what else might be hiding in plain sight. Some possibilities sound like the beginning of a fringe documentary. Lost cities under the Gulf, forgotten civilizations, wiped away by ancient tsunamis, a drowned golden age stretching from India to Spain. There is a reason these ideas are attractive. Coastlines really do move. During the early Holocene, sea levels rose steeply. Areas that once were dry land, like parts of the northern Persian Gulf, are now underwater. It is entirely plausible that fishing communities, small villages, even early towns existed in places now drowned, their traces covered by silt and seawater. We also know that climate can push societies hard. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia experienced a period of aridification sometimes linked to the fall of the Akkadian Empire. Earlier, during the late 4th millennium, shifts in water and settlement patterns accompanied the rise of Uruk period urbanism. In the wider Near East, lake cores and pollen records show pulses of wetter and drier phases across millennia. In that context, a story in which the gods change their minds about how much water should fall from the sky may echo old knowledge, that the environment does not stay still, and that sometimes change comes in ways that feel like judgment. It is fine to ask, could there have been a particularly severe flood, or sequence of floods, somewhere in the 4th or 3rd millennium BCE that left a mark on communal memory and fed into the written myths? Archaeologists and geologists have looked for such layers. In some Mesopotamian sites there are indeed thick deposits of flood silt separating occupation levels, suggesting local catastrophes. But these layers are not always simultaneous across cities, and they do not match a single date. This is where responsible speculation has to step gently. It is one thing to say, the flood myths probably weave together many experiences of disaster, river floods, heavy rains, political collapse into a single archetypal story. It is another to declare there was one global deluge on a specific year, drowning the entire earth, and the Sumerians recorded it exactly. The tablets we have are products of scribal craft. They compress, exaggerate, and arrange. Lifespans are stretched into the tens of thousands of years. Reigns are elongated. The scale is made cosmic. This is how myth works. It takes something local and turns it into a pattern that feels universal. And yet, they do feel historical in a certain way. Not because every number is accurate or every event corresponds cleanly to an excavated layer, but because they are preoccupied with very human problems: overcrowding, noise, labour, the fragility of cities, the fear that the system might break. Atrahasis worries about humans becoming too many and too loud. The gods are exhausted by their own design. Their solution is brutal population control by plague, famine, and flood. Behind the divine council, you can glimpse administrators thinking about grain rations, building projects, conscript labour, very real issues in early urban societies. Gilgamesh's flood story, while framed as myth, is told to a king who is grappling with the mortality of his friend and his own limits. The lesson is not about hydrology. It is about the fact that no matter how strong your walls are, you cannot wall out death. Even the absurdly long lives in the King List, kings ruling for 28,800 years, carry a kind of argument. By making the pre-flood rulers impossibly ancient, the text emphasizes that the present is different. Time is shorter now. Power is thinner, more contingent. Kings no longer stride the earth like semi-divine giants. They are mortal, ruling for dozens of years, not tens of thousands. So, when we ask what might be hidden in plain sight, the answer is not a secret code pointing to a single lost continent. It is something both smaller and more profound. These flood narratives preserve, in stylized form, layers of memory, of difficult water, of unstable skies, of social systems straining under their own weight. They embed claims about who has the right to rule and where, about which temples matter most, about how humans should relate to the powers that control rain and river. They are mosaics. Each tablet is a tessera of baked clay, one piece of a pattern that stretches not backwards into an unknowable golden age, but sideways across cities, fields, and marshes. When we read them carefully, we don't peel away the myth to get to what really happened. Instead, we see how people long ago arranged what happened into shapes they could live with. For drifting off to sleep, there is a kind of comfort in that. Behind the roaring waters and the angry gods, there is simply a floodplain civilization talking to itself about its deepest worry, that the water will rise too high, that the walls will fail, that the order they have built from mud and brick can be unmade in a few days of bad weather. Tonight those fears are old. The tablets lie quiet in museum drawers. The cities whose names they praise are long eroded back into dust. What remains is the pattern: boundary, warning, rebuilding. A reminder that even at the edge of disaster, someone is listening, someone is learning, someone is already imagining the world that will have to be rebuilt when the waters finally go down. So now we're standing very quietly on the far side of that boundary. We've walked with the King List, with Ziusudra, with Atrahasis, with Utanapishti in Gilgamesh. We've watched councils of gods argue about noise and labour and limits. We've seen kings stretch their reigns into impossible spans, then shrink back down to human size after the waters. Again and again the same shapes emerge. There is a world before the flood, elongated and luminous, where lifetimes are huge and kingship is freshly descended from heaven. There is the breaking point, where water stands in for all the ways order can fail. And there is the after, where numbers are more modest, cities more fragile, and humans know they can be wiped away. Why does that before matter so much? Partly because it gives weight to the present. If your city's kingship comes from a line that survived the flood, then your walls, your canal, your temple, everything around you is perched on the far shore of a cosmic disaster. The age before is not just nostalgia, it is a measuring stick. It tells you how far you've already fallen, and how much you still depend on the gods' patience. Partly too because before the flood is a container for questions people could not easily ask directly. What if we are too many? What if our work never ends? What if the gods themselves are tired of how we live? Atrahasis frames those anxieties as divine debates, but you can hear the human side underneath. Scribes and officials trying to make sense of crowded cities, ration lists, conscription, building programs that never seem to stop. The myth doesn't answer with statistics, it answers with a reset button, the flood, and a new set of rules for how many people the world can bear. And partly before the flood matters, because it is where they put their deepest sense of time. For the Sumerian King List, the pre-flood rulers are impossibly ancient. For Gilgamesh, Utanapishti belongs to that distant zone and cannot come back. The temple hymns, the shrines that existed before the flood, prove their antiquity and prestige. When a text says, "This city existed before the flood," it is doing what we might do when we say this mountain is older than our language. It is not a number, it is a way of saying this reaches beyond us. All of this rests on probabilities and careful guesses. We can say with some confidence that the tablets reflect real environments, a volatile floodplain, shifting rivers, unstable climate phases. We can say the myths borrow pieces from those realities and rearrange them for political and religious purposes. We can often date the tablets that survive and sometimes trace how a story changed as it was copied and recopied. But we cannot point to a single day when the flood happened and match it cleanly to a layer of silt. We cannot know exactly what an old Babylonian scribe believed in his own heart as he traced the cuneiform signs for great deluge. We only see the text, the choices he preserved, and the lines he let fall away. Many tablets are fragments. Others are known only from later copies. Interpretations overlap and sometimes disagree. So what we have is not a solved puzzle, but a field of possibilities. Some scholars emphasize political messaging. Others lean toward environmental memory, or see in Atrahasis early reflections on crowding and disease. Reconstructions of the earliest Ziusudra tradition remain tentative. Every new tablet, every rereading of a broken sign can tilt the picture slightly. That uncertainty can feel frustrating if you want a single definitive answer. This is what happened before the flood, but it is also what makes these texts so gentle to fall asleep with. They remind us that most of the past is like a shoreline at dusk. You see the curve of the coast, the way the waves have eaten into it. You can tell from the pattern of stones and sand that the water has risen and fallen many times. But you do not see every tide, you do not see every footprint. The clay tablets themselves are a kind of shoreline. They mark where thoughts once washed up and stopped. A scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay, line after line. The tablet dried, was shelved, perhaps copied. Then the library collapsed or burned or was buried in dust. For centuries no one read those words. The stories lay in the dark, their signs asleep. Now slowly we bring them back into light. An archaeologist uncovers a tablet. A specialist in cuneiform, working late under a lamp, deciphers a broken column where Utanapishti's boat is described, or where the King List quietly adjusts which city held kingship after the flood. The work is slow, patient, and full of maybe and it is possible that, between what the texts say and what the land still holds, there is a long quiet conversation. River sediments record their own history of rise and retreat. Marshes retain pollen from fields that no longer exist. Somewhere under the waters of the Gulf, old shorelines and abandoned channels wait, mute but not meaningless. Our job is not to make them shout a single answer, but to listen for patterns. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine those ancient landscapes at rest. The old levees, now just low ridges, the channels the rivers no longer fill. The cities that once feared the flood, now reduced to small hills of baked brick. Above them, in museum drawers far away, the tablets breathe only when we read them. Memory, in that sense, is not a straight line but a tide. Stories move up and back, erasing, rewriting, leaving thin lines of salt on the stones of history. We step carefully, compare text to layer, legend to core sample, myth to map. We do not rush. The past is in no hurry. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this quiet shoreline, you've been part of that patience. If you'd like more slow journeys like this, more nights wandering through old texts and older landscapes, it helps a lot if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you'll find your way back here next time. And if you're still awake, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Somewhere, it's late. Somewhere, the rivers outside your window are higher or lower than they were a generation ago. Somewhere, another tablet is being read for the first time in thousands of years. For now, the gods are quiet. The waters are, for the moment, in their beds. And the stories of before the flood can settle back into the dark, waiting for the next pair of tired eyes to find them.